Um, so, first of all, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Nick Robinson. I'm a lecturer at Yale University, both in political science and in the law school, where I teach in human rights and legal ethics. I had spent a number of years previously in South Asia, particularly in India and Pakistan. So that's a lot of my perspective and focus on this set of issues. I had the great pleasure of working with ABA Role, particularly with my co-author Kat, but also it was really a team effort, and the wisdom of ABA Role, whether it was with Betsy and Linda and so many others in the organization, to put together this issue paper that people have been very kindly referencing throughout the day, and very always appreciate the kind references and knowing that when you write something that it's being read and used to think about this set of issues. So the mission of this panel is to explore individuals' experiences, so particularly personal experiences with corruption, disenfranchisement, discrimination, injustice that can lead to radicalization, and what types of interventions might be successful in combating this. And I think there's a set of challenges around these issues. And so three that have come up in our conversation so far, and I think we're going to unpackage some more in this panel, is one is, well, what we don't know. And it turns out we don't know a lot. There's a lot of things we don't know. So what do you do in that context? Second, but we do know some things. We shouldn't be nihilistic about this. We do know some things. But what do we do with what we do know, right? What kinds of interventions? It's one thing to know it, but what do you do coming out of that? And then third, which I think, I wish there would be more focus on frequently in government and in rule of law circles, and certainly outside of rule of law circles, which is how do you make sure that you're doing more good than harm, right? Kind of the Hippocratic oath of the rule of law world. And how do you think about that question, particularly in a situation where you have imperfect knowledge? So we're lucky to have a really superb, very experienced, and thoughtful group of panelists. What I'm going to do is just give some very brief introductions. There's much fuller biographies in the materials that you have. And then I'm also going to make sure, like the other panelists, to leave some time at the end of our conversation. There's so much. I've been impressed all day just about the kind of the experience and insights in the room, and to be able to bring you all into the conversation as well in the second half. So maybe I'll start down here to my left. I'm going to be looking left and right to make sure people aren't trying to join the conversation. But is Mohammed Fraser Rahim, who is the executive director North America for Quellium International, which is a counter-extremist organization with headquarters in the UK, interestingly founded in part by former violent extremists themselves. Mohammed previously served as a senior program officer at USIP, where he led their Horn of Africa programs, and served as an expert on CVE issues at the Institute. His areas of specialty are on transnational terrorist movements, Islamic intellectual history, Islam in America, and contemporary theology in the Muslim world. Directly to my left here is Shannon Green, who's the director and senior fellow of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Among many other roles there, she managed CSIS's Commission on Countering Violent Extremism, which was co-chaired by Tony Blair and Leon Panetta, and co-authored, I very much recommend this to you, the excellent Turning Point report that came out of that commission about CVE. Prior to joining CSIS, Shannon was the senior director for global engagement on the National Security Council, and prior to that, she worked at the Center of Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at USAID. Directly to my right is Michelle Brady, who is an ABA Rowley Senior Advisor. She currently manages programming in both Egypt and Morocco. Prior to joining ABA Roley's DC office, she served as the deputy chief of the Rule of Law Unit at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, Poland. She's also served as an international training advisor with IDLO in Afghanistan and as a program director for ABA Roley in Azerbaijan. So a lot of experience. And then Ben Nichols is to my distant right, who's an associate professor and academic chair of transnational threats and counterterrorism at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Ben's research focuses on terrorism and counterterrorism, political violence, and human security, particularly in Africa. He does a lot of work with African governments, with militaries in Africa. Prior to joining the Africa Center, Ben was a faculty researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. So a wealth of experiences here. So I think I'll start with you, Shannon, where throughout the day we've been pointing at some of the different drivers of individual radicalization. But I think the Turning Point report you wrote does such a good job of laying out kind of the lay of the land here, and particularly the diversity of drivers, right? When you're thinking about this between countries, so we were just talking a lot about ISIS in the last panel, but thinking about what drivers are in different country contexts and how that might change. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the findings out of that report.
Sure. So what I'll do, Nick asked me to just sort of give a broad landscape of what we know about the drivers related to radicalization. So I thought I would start at the widest point and then narrow in a little bit. So I think most people are aware that, generally speaking, experts have coalesced around this idea of there being intersecting push and pull factors, often operating within fragile, oppressive, or conflict-affected environments that help explain the phenomenon of violent extremism. Structural conditions such as real and perceived marginalization, grievances, experiences of injustice, or frustration with corruption can push individuals towards violent extremist organizations. At the same time, radical recruitment narratives, propaganda, and having social ties to extremist networks can help pull them in. Other researchers have also pointed to psychological factors, so I think this came up in the last panel, such as impulsive, thrill-seeking behavior, a desire to exact revenge, or right perceived wrongs. So sometimes there is a positive motivation in the sense that somebody wants to do something positive for their group or for marginalized groups that they think are being harmed, and end up joining a violent extremist organization based on that impulse. So in other words, as Nick mentioned, the drivers are numerous, they're contextual. If you look at all those drivers, what can be frustrating for a practitioner is the fact that that basically describes all of the bad things that happen both in developing and developed countries. And it's really difficult to program against something that is that sort of diverse and broad. At the same time, I do think that we're finding at a macro level, there is increasing evidence that experiences of injustice, political disenfranchisement, and human rights abuses are the most salient or amongst the most salient factors in pushing individuals towards adopting extremist ideologies, narratives, and attitudes. So there have been a number of studies that have found that a profound sense of alienation and injustice from formal state structures can motivate people to join terrorist groups, where governments are predatory and corrupt, where they don't see their objective as ultimately protecting and serving the people. Recruits can be largely motivated by a desire for dignity and justice and a search for something better than what they're currently being offered. Studies have also found that there's a significant correlation between gross human rights abuses, such as extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, and policies undermining religious freedom, and a high incidence of terror attacks. So I wanted to mention a couple of these studies, and again, these are at a macro level, but they're, I think, the emerging evidence base that draws me to conclude that in particular environments, this interaction or this experience with the state does help explain why terrorist organizations have done or have been more successful in recruiting. So Mercy Corps did a study in 2015, and they drew on interviews with youth in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Somalia. And essentially what it found is that the principal drivers of political violence are not rooted in poverty, not rooted in a lack of access to education, but rather in experiences of injustice, discrimination, corruption, and abuse by security forces. Likewise, the 2016 Global Terrorism Index, like the one before it, which is based on an analysis of data, so it's very statistically driven, show that there are two distinct factors that are related to whether or not terrorism happens within a country. The first is political violence committed by the state. So their research finds that 93% of all terrorist attacks between 1989 and 2014, which is the period that they were looking at in the data, occurred in countries with high levels of state-sponsored terror, involving extrajudicial killings, torture, and imprisonment without trial. Similarly, over 90% of all terrorist deaths occurred in countries already engaged or already experiencing some form of conflict, whether that was internal or external. So if you take these two data points, this means that only 0.5% of terrorist attacks occur in countries that were not suffering from conflict or political terror. So that, to me, I think really says something. The State Department also did its own meta-analysis of a bunch of academic and practitioner studies. And that study also concluded that the single biggest factor amongst all environments were citizens' experience with violence at the hands of their own state. And then finally, as Nick mentioned, we did a comprehensive study on violent extremism and ways to counter it, interviewing hundreds of people. And we found, again, this sense that government repression, people feeling disconnected from the formal structures and the formal authorities of the state made them highly vulnerable to violent extremism. So one person that we interviewed, I think, really encapsulated this view. He said he's a former extremist, now living in London, and he said, if you're living under a dictatorship, people will look for an outlet because they're already facing injustice and equality. And then that's something that we found repeatedly when we talk to youth and former violent extremism. So I think, again, it's important to point out that this varies from state to state, including based on the level of development in that country. But the big picture is, and I think this is sometimes an inconvenient truth, particularly for governments working on CVE, big picture is that state repression, state violence against their own people, a lack of rule of law, high degrees of corruption, injustice, and people feeling like they're suffering at the hands of their own state does seem to be correlated with violent extremism in a number of environments. And I think it's really important to foot stomp that because oftentimes we want to think about CVE as a really technical issue. So you do your analysis in a local community, which is really important. And you say, okay, this group of people doesn't have access to some economic opportunities or is feeling left out of the political process. So you do some programs at that level. But at the same time, if the state is abusive towards its own population, you still have a major problem. So I think it's important to keep both kind of that macro national picture as well as the local picture.
So I'll ask you, Mohammed, to follow up on this about does that basic portrait that Shannon just painted for us very lucidly jive with your experiences and the experience of Quelliam International, and whether you could also talk about the experience of the founders of Quelliam International, who were violent extremists themselves, and what is that story about how they joined and why they're doing what they're doing now? And is that a representational story? How do you think about that set of issues?
Great question, and thanks for allowing me to be here as well. I'll start off to say I think it's important because you really captured well about the work that I'm doing presently with Quelliam. So I will say that in my past life, I was a counterterrorism officer. I worked in the intelligence community. After that, I worked as a peace builder at U.S. Institute of Peace. And then now I'm somewhere in between working the issue of counter-extremism, working with former extremists and a former intel officer. And I think it's interesting to really think a bit deeper about how we're addressing violent extremism based off of the various optic points or the various vantage points that we are all collectively coming from as well. The academic community certainly will debate and use the argument to say that CVE means one thing, and perhaps we need to parse out that language much more at a nuanced fashion. Those in the practitioner community will see the vantage point of CVE from very on-the-ground grassroots perspective, and then governments will have to deal with the issue of CVE from largely, historically speaking, and I think we're evolving from a counterterrorism landscape. I mean, I used to use the argument to say that CVE was part of the larger counterterrorism toolkit. And now that I've been out of government, I can say that it's a much more nuanced, very surgical approach that we have to engage in this. And so I have been with Quilliam for the past 2 months, essentially, actually, a month and a couple weeks. And as our colleague mentioned, Quilliam's vantage point is coming from the founder, one of the founders, Maajid Nawaz, who's a former extremist himself, who joined joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, an organization that had a UK chapter, and then also he was unfortunately tortured in Mubarak's prison chambers as well. And so his vantage point comes from sort of coming from the West and understanding first and foremost that the Western context as it relates to violent extremism with Islamist groups, because I think we need to obviously be candid. There are many sort of violent extremists from very spectrum, from those who are white nationalists, etc. So let's be candid there. But from his optic point, he was very much affected by sort of the UK experience, and the UK experience certainly shaped his recruitment approach, his motivation and rationale too as well. And if you look at his book, you'll see some of his experiences certainly being affected by growing up in a very affluent family in Essex, and some of the challenges that he struggled with there. So as it relates to sort of my colleague who mentioned the points, I would agree in many of the points that she mentioned. I would also highlight from her viewpoints that, for example, the case study of Kenya, the terminology of CVE, or using that language for the protection of the state or for political purposes, is something that has been done in a way to manipulate communities as well. We have elections taking place at the present time, and so this broad brush of securitization, of protecting its citizenry against al-Shabaab or ISIS or Daesh, al-Qaeda, etc., has largely been sort of, and unfortunately, the terminology that's been used in many of the public lexicon. And so how do you balance between the securitization of a community and using very charged language of saying this is in the spirit of protecting communities against violent extremism, and not parsing it out enough? Where is this transnational terrorism, or is this dealing with the state itself that's cramping down? If you look at the coast in Kenya, as just one example, you've seen organizations, civil society organizations like Haki Africa, Muhuri, Muslims for Human Rights, who have certainly seen the effect of the state itself clamping down as well. And I think there's also the other examples that we've seen communities that have been radicalized because of what they see as external influences into their communities. For example, in Nigeria, Boko Haram was radicalized because they had issues against the Nigerian government's inability to address their concerns. The same example in Somalia too as well with al-Shabaab. Algeria, Al-Qaeda's quintessential franchise, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, was created because of, initially the first grievance was against the Algerian government. So there's enough examples to definitely highlight that there is sort of government's inability to address local communities' concerns, and this inability to address this also drives and fuels extremism. I always argue to say that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Hopefully later we'll talk a little bit more about some interventions. But again, it's a very we have to constantly reevaluate what we're doing to provide precision, accuracy, and surgical understanding of this threat.
So maybe building off of that, I'll turn over here to Ben and thinking, just both reflecting off of what the last two speakers said, and when we're thinking about the kind of precision that you need to use and the kind of array of players, maybe comment a bit about when we think of extremist groups, who are the different players within these? Are they being motivated for the same by the same purpose, and are they being motivated by the same drivers, whether that's injustice or experiences with marginalization at different points of recruitment and period within these organizations? So maybe you can.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for the question. Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here. As was mentioned, I work at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Should mention that's a U.S. government institution, but the comments here are my own. Yeah, I mean, in terms of different types of participation, I think this is another form of contextualization that may be very important for us to consider. I mean, I would just add to my colleagues by joining them in saying that diversity of drivers, yes, and I would say kind of drivers related to abuses of rule of law also seem to stand out in different ways. And we've seen that in a number of violent extremist or terrorist groups on the continent of Africa as well, both in kind of general literature and then also in some specific studies where there are interviews with former members or those kinds of things. In terms of thinking about the different types of participation, it's another form of contextualization, as I mentioned. And I'm just coming off of a program last week in Algiers where we were working with the African Union to think just about this question specifically. And, we tried to talk a little bit about the motivations and the profiles, to use a challenged word perhaps, of leaders, foreign terrorist fighters, ordinary members or rank and file foot soldiers, but also forced recruits. And one of the things I think we need to keep in mind when we think about terrorist groups is that not all people participating in terrorism are radicals or have been radicalized. Right? That relationship between radicalization and terrorism is also one that needs to be thought through. So just to pick up one of the examples that I just mentioned, forced recruitment is a challenge for some of the, or is a challenge in some of the societies facing terrorist groups like in Nigeria or in Somalia. Reports suggest that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been forced into those organizations. The Mercy Corps report, maybe a different one than what has been cited thus far, but there was one from 2016, talked about a spectrum of force of leading people to participate in Boko Haram. There's things like coercion, intimidation, threats, pressure on individuals to join, but there's also just abduction of individuals who are brought in. And I think when you have that type of circumstance, you also need to think about rule of law questions that have to do with why people join, but also why people stay. And those may not always be the same sets of motivations. And the way that people got involved in these organizations may have implications for how you want to deal with them in terms of rule of law questions on the other hand. So when people come out of them, what type of approaches do you have to have ready to deal with those who are forced in initially or those who joined kind of willingly?
Thank you. That's great. So I'll turn now to Michelle. First of all, you should feel free to comment on any of the discussion about drivers, but I also want to start turning the conversation a bit towards thinking about how do you, if we're thinking about the kinds of grievances that are potentially in different contexts, getting people to be radicalized, grievances with the state, grievances with society more generally, how do you go about identifying what those grievances are, and what are some of the mechanisms or tools that are out there that are at disposal to kind of think about, well, what are these grievances even in the first place? And if you want to talk about your work in Morocco or elsewhere, and address that question.
Sure. So thank you for the question, and good afternoon to everyone. And I think I can share something very interesting from the work that we're doing in Morocco currently. We've been implementing some program in Morocco for a number of years now. We've had an office there for more than 10 years. And right now we have two main programs, one really focusing on anti-corruption that has a number of components, and another program that focuses on participatory governance at the local level. So maybe I'll start there first. Our program on participatory governance basically aims to bring together, in light of the new constitution in Morocco shortly after 2011, bring together civil society and the governing body at the local commune level together to try to really bring together the perspective of civil society and the perspective of citizens to the government, and explain to them what the perspectives are, what the issues are, and we work with them to provide training, provide support to them, to further their advocacy efforts, their ability to make recommendations for policy reform, and also to draft legislation. And what the ultimate aim is, of course, is that the citizens in those local areas, we're working in Marrakesh, Demnet, and soon to be Tanger, is really to have their voice heard, and the issues that are important to them and the kind of complaints that they have to really be heard and have the government be responsive to that. And to also, of course, empower civil society along the way. Morocco has a pretty good history, a pretty active and vocal civil society, but we have seen from needs assessments that we've done and kind of questionnaires that we've given out that there can sometimes also be a misunderstanding or a mistrust between the various bodies. So through civil society organizations that really represent the people, that could potentially be an avenue or a way to kind of identify the grievances, because of course they're in touch with the people, that's who they represent, and to bring that voice before the government. And also, I mean, indirectly in this way, the citizen voice is heard, but also through the process, the citizens can also themselves directly participate as well. So at the same time, let me be clear too also up front that the work we're doing in Morocco is not geared towards countering violent extremism. We're not, we cannot say that the work that we're doing definitively can somehow, contribute to this, but we have seen from the work that we're doing that it may be able to somehow shed light on the situation, or as the discussion all day has been kind of how the backbone of rule of law and rule of law in general, kind of some of the things we commonly talk about can really shed light on this. So through this way, I mean, and some of the issues that in our needs assessments that we've done in Marrakesh and in Demnet as well, that have been identified by the civil society and the government as issues they want to work in, include things like economics and job reform. They include things like, social support and identifying and really trying to meet the challenge of various social injustice. The communities we work in have diverse membership. We work in rural and also more urban areas, also with different ethnic communities in those different areas. So you kind of have different people that we're talking about. And Demnet, for instance, is, it's a more rural area. It's at the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. So that, it doesn't have sort of maybe the job opportunities that Tanger or Marrakesh might have, for instance. So they're also looking at things regarding youth, regarding sort of local and social heritage. So these type of things are the issues that we hope that by bringing together civil society and bringing together the leaders of the local communes that we can do our part through our assistance to help. The other piece as well that we're working on the anti-corruption program has a number of components. We're doing literacy, we're doing education really at the middle school level and also in literacy centers. We also support a organization of lawyers that provides legal advice, legal advice, yes. They don't themselves take on cases, but when people come to them and say, hey, I had this issue with my neighbor, or I was the victim, I think, of some type of fraud, or maybe a minor assault, or I think I have some property dispute or some issue with the government, what do I do? Where do I go? We don't take on their case per se, the organization that we support, but they then tell them, okay, you think you might have experienced some corruption with the government, this is the process that you can follow. Or you think you were maybe assaulted, but you don't have money, or something happened that's maybe a criminal law matter, but you don't have the money to pay for someone, they would then refer them to a lawyer. But of course, those centers have heard, the citizens have come to them and said, hey, we've experienced examples of corruption, but we also have heard about other complaints as well. So, we kind of advertise that, if you have this issue, please come and speak to us. But of course, once people kind of heard that, they said, well, I just have an issue and I need to talk to a lawyer. And didn't even know that, there was kind of a lawyer around that they could talk to. So they kind of were eager to have the chance. So we've kind of seen that can be potentially an entry point for people to kind of come and people, I guess, kind of anywhere doing sort of public defender or legal aid work know that you kind of end up hearing a lot of complaints,
kind of
yeah,
stories. Yeah,
and
no.
grievances. So that's kind of one thing we've seen in our work as well. Maybe also sort of jumping to the other side of what maybe sort of interventions or things that might work. We've done through our anti-corruption program, we've done sort of some pre and post tests, trying to evaluate people's sort of knowledge before we give them training or provide them with information, and then also ask them questions afterwards, trying to gauge what we were speaking to them about were largely due process rights, rights of victims, rights of defendants, rights of witnesses, this kind of thing. And what we found out oftentimes is that people didn't understand sort of even what these things were, like what are you talking about? And then when we were sharing with them and explaining to them in a way that kind of was at their level, whether they were students or they were maybe illiterate adults at the literacy centers we were working with, that as their level of knowledge increased about the system and about various rights of the actors involved there, we also were questioning them about their perception of trust in their system and in their government. And we found that as they were reporting that their knowledge increased, they also were reporting that their trust in the system and in the government actors was increasing. So one example I can share that we had was some students were explaining that during the course of the discussion and the training that they didn't understand in two separate instances. One child was reporting, an alleged drug dealer was, released. Everybody knew he was a drug dealer. And then sometime later, he was released back into our community, and we didn't understand why. That seemed, from a child's perspective, that's kind of a, maybe a bad person. Why is he, back out here again? And another person saying, there's alleged, child molester in our neighborhood and sort of similar situation. And, the children somehow knew of the arrest, and then the person was brought back, and they didn't understand this, and they didn't know kind of why did this happen, how could this happen. But as we were describing to them, well, these are what human rights are, what defendants' rights are as well, that you have a right to bail, for instance, that there's a presumption of innocence, and explaining that to them how the justice system in Morocco worked. They then said, oh, we didn't know that, you know what I mean? And that this person hasn't been convicted. You don't exactly, again, to the level of a student. But then they understood this, and somehow, maybe they couldn't quite grasp the big legal concept of it. But at the end of this, we found that they also said, okay, now I understand that concept, and I also somehow believe or feel like I know what my government is doing. I have a better sort of feel for it. Yeah.
Built into the trust of the state. And I think this is fascinating. And it builds into thinking about what kinds of interventions work. And I want to jump back here to Shannon about, what I think is a really hard conceptual point, which you also mentioned, where, these programs aren't called CVE programs, right? And so when you're thinking about implementation challenges, one is not only are they not called CVA programs, we don't know, did it stop violent extremists from developing in Morocco? We could tell a story about that, which is probably pretty robust, that yes, it did, but we're not sure, right? What's the counterfactual, right? Maybe, or we can show that, you're getting more trust of individuals with the state. So these all seem like good things. I mean, how do you, how do you know, how do you think about this set of issues? What do you think of as successful kinds of interventions?
So two things before I go to that. I do want to mention, I think when you're talking about grievances and abuses and forced conscription into violent extremist organizations, you can lose sight of the fact that for some people, they do have agency. They join these organizations as an aspirational social act. They join because they're searching for meaning and belonging. They're searching for a place in their life where they can contribute. And I think while we focus on the death and the destruction and the beheadings of ISIS, for a lot of people, ISIS was a joyful revolutionary movement. And at least early on, I mean, it's hard to understand, but at least early on, a lot of people were joining because they wanted to be a part of building something. So I think it's important not to lose sight of that, because it also gets to your point about interventions, which is like, yes, you need to address these underlying grievances and factors, but you also need to address the fact that human nature, particularly for young people, is to try to sort of buck up against the system, and it's to try to find your identity and find meaning and a place in the world for yourself. And so the answer can't always just to be like, chill out, like be moderate, like just sit on your couch and watch TV. Like we have to think of ways to help young people find that purpose and ways to contribute, but in a way that's peaceful and not destructive. So I just wanted to mention that. In terms of your question, I mean, I think this is really one of the conceptual challenges that has bedeviled CVE efforts. And I actually think that the lack of definition, the lack of parameters, what is CVE, what's not, has held back the field. I think some degree of debate is healthy, but I can tell you in our numerous conversations within the CVE Commission, and particularly with the Hill, this is something that really perturbs people. And this is part of the reason why appropriators have had such a hard time allocating money to CVE, because they're afraid that practitioners are merely trying to relabel or rename everything they do in the development space as CVE. So I think we need to be much more rigorous in figuring out what is CVE relevant, what are those factors at the community level that will help make those communities more resilient to extremist ideas, narratives, and recruitment efforts. And that might be civic education, and that might be job training programs, and that might be a whole host of other kinds of things. But when it comes to CVE specific activities, identifying those interventions that are oriented towards those people who have already taken an interest in an extremist group, or sort of moving towards the path of joining an extremist group or in the process of being radicalized, and very specific interventions to sort of peel them back before they go over the edge into violence. And we can talk about what those programs look like. In the US, they're few and far between. Internationally, there are more of them. But I think like we do need to start to be much more specific and rigorous in what we call CVE, because there is this phenomenon of like, if everything is CVE, then nothing is CVE. And it also introduces the measurement challenges that you mentioned. If we don't know exactly what we're trying to achieve, are we trying to fundamentally transform societies? Are we trying to prevent people from tipping over into violence, but we're okay if they have extremist ideas? Are we trying to narrow the pool of recruits? Like once you identify your objective, you can figure out ways of measuring it. But the fact that this has been sort of such a vague space really makes it difficult.
I'm actually bringing Ben on this point, thinking about both how do you think about successful interventions, and also what are some of the dangers and challenges in these interventions?
Well, I mean, I've just kind of build off of what was just said. I mean, I think that you're right about the CVE relevant and the CVE specific distinction. I think one of the challenges is that it's not in everyone's interest to make that distinction, right? Because if you can be, I mean, that's basically more or less pointing out that, a lot of rule of law things, state-society contract, the social contract, state-society relations, trust are good things. They probably have something to do with not having less conflict and terrorism. So generally, should we work on those things? Absolutely. But when people are trying to fund for countering terrorism or countering violent extremism, if you split between relevant and specific, you're probably going to get money for the specific. You're not necessarily going to get the money for the relevant. And that's one reason why everybody's trying to make the connection, connect the dots in some way for a lot of programs back. And I would just say that I've seen this challenge here in the U.S. and partner nations, but also on the continent in Africa, where people that I work with are very attuned to this. A lot of the people who know the language of CVE and PVE from the UN, preventing violent extremism, as one person told me, that we know that language because it's a cash cow, as someone just bluntly told me. And
but it's not yet. That's the funny thing.
Well, but if you want to do partnering with international organizations, it can be. It can be the way that you get certain programs connected. I mean, in general, the people who work on terrorism the defense and security professionals that I work with mainly, also line ministries and civil society actors. But in general, CVE is a new language, at least in Africa, and doesn't resonate much. Terrorism resonates more. So you have kind of that challenge, and then you have challenge of civil society organizations that I've seen both in, let's say, in Britain and in Nigeria, who have decided to avoid adopting that language because they're concerned that it's a fad or a fashion, and that what's going to happen is if they connect their programs too strongly to that language, 18 months from now, they're not going to get funded in the next funding cycle. And so they want to do this work of, let's say, working with law enforcement on rules of engagement, or they want to work with, at-risk youth or something. But they're worried that if they connect it too strongly to one policy language or discourse, that they're vulnerable to the time or the moment when that shifts. So maybe that's at least one point I wanted to add in on some of the challenges of how to describe it. Maybe I'll pass to somebody else to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of some specific programs.
Maybe I'll go over to you, Mohammed. I know you've been involved in some of these programs, just kind of how you think about this generally, and maybe speak a little about some of the interventions you've been involved in.
So, I mean, this is a really good question, and it's difficult because in the domestic space, as you all probably know, we're sort of dancing between domestic and overseas. There's been the big debate of communities themselves taking the $10 million CVE funding. And the question is, internally, is this something that the community wants to accept? And are there strings attached to it as well? So there's been a lot of debate between communities from California to Minneapolis to Minnesota, I should say, to Washington, D.C. on how do you engage this. And it's a big to be continued where the next steps are going to develop and manifest itself on it. As it relates to, I would say, the issues of intervention, with Quilliam and the work that we're doing, I mean, we play very 50,000 foot, and then we also are very much working in the community. And it's important to highlight that. Just yesterday, I just hired a program manager to work on the issues of some interventions that we're about to launch. Now, what are these interventions? These interventions are dealing with young kids who have been radicalized. This is not theoretical at all. This is very real world, practical, young people, women. They aren't just minorities. They are white kids from middle America, if you will. And the issue is, and they range there from, sort of white nationalist recruitment to also Islamist extremist organizations. And so I'll give you two programs that we're running right now that I think are interesting. One is something called, and again, we're just starting in North America, and I'm leading the effort, so we're putting a lot of the processes in place. But one is something to deal with critical thinking. So we're working on an initiative to address the issue of how do you apply real-world critical thinking. And we borrowed from the Socratic method, but it is in this particular project we have running is dealing with young kids who have been vulnerable to one aspect of violent extremism, which is Islamist organizations recruitment. And we have tapped into addressing the psychological, the individual. So there's a social worker involved. There is a religious counselor, even though we know ideology is just one component out of many other factors. And we have also vetted some of the religious clerics. This is still being developed, but we'll have a report coming out on this as this kind of matures up. But one of the individuals, for example, with the religious leaders, some of them aren't equipped and trained in this area. Just because you are a religious person doesn't mean, for example, an imam or a sheikh, etc., doesn't mean that you're equipped to deal with someone who has been radicalized. So we've learned that this is some of the best practices we've learned, or good practices, I should say, from our experiences in Europe. And this critical thinking program that we have also addresses, holistically speaking, the psychological, the mental health counseling, and then also job entrepreneurship skill set. So this project is in Washington and then also in Minneapolis, Minnesota too as well. I'll stop there on that.
And if I can maybe add one other thing too, just again from our experience in Morocco, and building upon points that were made during the keynote over lunch and even earlier today, that I mean, the work that we're doing in Morocco, there's a big public awareness raising component to it as well. And so what we did from the outset was look at really kind of what are the ways that are specific to the Moroccan context of how people receive information or how they will receive messages the best. There was talk over the keynote about, social media and, and the dark net and all these type of things. So we're clearly not using the darknet in Morocco, but when we started out our programming, we identified that things like public caravans or plays, or there's one particular radio station that has a really wide viewership still in Morocco, whereas in other places radio is not really a big deal. social media, still some certain print media in certain locations, other things like this, that brochures, posters, and then, that are done, in the right language or languages, and that are presented in a certain way, and that are placed in the right places, in public areas, or maybe through civil society, at government buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And this is something that's actually been really well received. For instance, in one of our programs, we've done a number of public conferences that have brought together various legal professionals in the public to talk about various sort of due process rights and other legal rights, if you will. And then in a number of instances, the day after, one of our senior staff from Morocco, along with other local Moroccan experts, went on a radio station, basically building upon the discussion at the public conference the day before. And there was a viewership, and it was on a radio station that then, shared sort of the feedback or the range of that particular broadcast at over 1 million people. So, that's kind of one way, too, of also trying to kind of, get out the message. And if people are listening, or if people are viewing something, or they're showing up to see a play, which was also recorded and, put on YouTube, et cetera, kind of needing to find out, or, stopping in to consider what is the message we're trying to get out, what other maybe counter messages are out there, or just a lack of messaging, and then finding, depending on the context you're working in, really tailoring how to reach those people. Yeah.
Hard work. So I think at this point I'd like to open it up to the broader community here for questions. We have some time. And when you have a question, if you can just introduce yourself briefly and say if you're directing it towards a specific panelist, or the whole panel can answer.
My name is Muhammad Yusuf. I'm a chief judge in Egypt and currently a fellow at the Federal Judicial Center. Actually, it's not a direct question, but it's like sharing thoughts out of our experience in Egypt. We have a long history in fighting terrorism. During the period from 2000 to 2010, the government adopted a policy by which it focused mainly on rehabilitation and integration of terrorists who's serving sentences in prison, in addition to extremists. And they had a progress throughout these years, which this is not based actually on a research or statistical information, but it's like first-hand information that I had through my experience. In addition, I can figure out, I think, that the way that these organizations recruit people, it seems that like they're using modern science like NLP, for instance, neuro-linguistic programming. So is this a fact? That do they use this kind of techniques? Another insight which I have is it's important to draw a line between those who are prone to extremism and those who are religious or just can be considered as pious or devout persons, which is there is kind of overlap in many countries, especially in Middle East countries. So it's very important to draw this kind of fine line.
So,
Thank you.
These kinds of challenges of over-targeting. Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on that?
No, just on the religion question, I mean, one of the things that we found in the commission was actually that the degree of religious devotion was not at all correlated with somebody's propensity towards violent extremism. We did find, however, that people who had recently converted into a new religion were particularly vulnerable because that moment introduces a lot of flux, a lot of uncertainty in somebody's life. New actors are coming in. They don't know that much about their religion, so they're subject to people interpreting it for them in a way that serves that recruiter's interest. So I just wanted to pick up on that. And then on the issue of religious freedom, we actually found also that countries that try to suppress the outward expression of religious devotion had higher rates of foreign fighters traveling to join extremist organizations.
And then,
Yeah, my name is Godfrey Musila. I'm with the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. I must say, I find the lack of definition of rigor in this area quite problematic from the perspective of rights. And I thank you for making reference to Kenya. I know a little bit about Kenya, and I'll make reference to that. I would step back instead of asking what is countering extremist violence, I would ask the question, what is extremist violence? Because what you find, and Kenya is a good example, is that you've had people that have had historic grievances around dispossession of land, particularly in agrarian societies. Land is a big deal. Where you had dispossession by the colonial power, then upon departure, this land was acquired through dubious means by the political elite. And Coast Province, which you make reference to, for instance, you have essentially either absentee landlords or the political elite, including the president's family, being the largest landowners in this part of the world. So even before the advent of countering terrorism, this grievances existed, and a lot of people thought that the new constitution would solve this problem of dispossession. It actually does, by requiring the state to pass legislation to cap land ownership and so on, and to address those historical injustices through restitution. But nothing is being done in this respect. So you see that these counterterrorism efforts have been used and are being used as we speak by the political elite, essentially to silence those demands for justice, which is economic justice, and to some degree political justice. So I would step back a little bit and pose this question: what is violent extremism? Do you need an ideological element to it? And to what extent would ordinary folks, of course, there are some people who have become radicalized during the process, but to what extent would ordinary demands cross the line and become phenomena that would fall under violent extremism?
Did you want to?
Yeah, I guess the brief version so we can get other questions into as well. I mean, I think in extremist violence, to answer your question directly, in the Kenyan context or the Horn of Africa region, it's anything that it's part of elements that push back against the status quo. And it's interesting. I was in Tanzania a couple months ago, and we're doing a scoping trip. And the whole time I was there, I didn't use the language CVE at all. I mean, obviously, doing a lot of work within the region, and I knew very quickly this is not the language we want to use, right? Social cohesion, tolerance, building trust, etc. And being there in Tanzania, the issues they had that came up was land conflict. And because land conflict, because the colonial period not addressing these concerns, communities, Maasai communities, traditional communities, were radicalized based off of them not being allowed to express their grievances in a formal process. And then the other issue that came up, particularly in Tanzania, particularly in the island of Zanzibar, was the issue of child rape. Child rape is one of the most important, all the interviews we conducted, did over about 60, it was the most important issue that ranged from religious leaders to governmental to police, etc. So the transnational terrorism extremism that we're talking about, whether it's Daesh, Al-Qaeda, etc., is sort of a third order effect when real world issues are addressing communities on how do you arbitrate this land challenge, how do you deal with this real child rape issue. And for them, this is an extreme issue that's taking place in their communities, and the perpetrators are amongst them.
I think this is, there's a number of other questions outstanding, but this is a really important question too. Does anybody else want to jump in on this point? Or?
No. I mean, I think it's really important. The definitional issues are really important because governments have been able to use the CT and CVE frames to justify a lot of abhorrent behavior and human rights abuses. My colleague Lana Baidas and I wrote a piece on this, and basically what we said is you need tighter definitions, otherwise they're subject to abuse. I think the other thing about what Mohammed is saying is that a lot of extremist organizations have been very adept identifying those local grievances, whether it be over land rights or child rape, which is just horrific, and sort of fuse them to this broader narrative. So that's definitely, again, where we need to look at those local conflicts, those local grievances, because they're sort of ripe for being exploited by extremist organizations and used as part of a recruitment narrative.
Do you want to jump in on this? Yeah, sure.
I mean, I agree, and I also think that we see the same type of challenge of trying to leverage herder-farmer violence in the Sahel and in West Africa as well, with the Messina Liberation Front and new types of organizations. Absolutely, I agree that counterterrorism is used to basically as a form of repression or to keep opposition down. And I think the main point I want to make here is that I wonder what we've done by coming up with the term violent extremism and countering violent extremism. My own experience is that between 2001 and around 2005, when that expression kind of emerged, people had a lot of debates about definitions of terrorism, and eventually people decided that maybe they wouldn't come to one definition, but they kind of got tired about just having that definitional debate. And I think the violent extremism shift has led to a number of new debates. And my own impression is that one of the challenges about that term is I think it emerged from a response rather than from a conceptualization of a threat. So, terrorism led to counterterrorism. Actually, that has an interesting etymology as well. But, countering violent extremism, from what I could tell, it'd be interesting to write an etymology and kind of history of that expression. I think it comes around 2005 and then eventually gets taken up from the U.S. into international institutions, then transformed into PBE. But, that started as a response, as a way of responding to terrorism. But they changed the name. They didn't change counter, which could have been changed maybe to prevent. They changed they left that, and then they changed what the threat was. But I think that then we've tried to kind of reverse engineer what we think this threat is out of a series of responses, which leaves us with a number of questions, frankly.
I'm going to follow the mic.
Thank you very much. Real quickly, the political scientist in me is thinking about failed states, and the term I haven't heard here today, but it's here. It's legitimacy. I mean, there's a huge critique about states not doing their jobs, if you will, however we define that, and there being at least in some connection to grievance, and therefore maybe the connections there for the violence as well. States are repositories, it occurs to me, states are repositories of all the aspirations of a, quote, people. And when they fail, which they do inevitably, everybody can get angry. A guy will stand in a line for a year at a motor vehicle place to get a license. But if he thinks he had to stand there because of identity issues, he's going to pick up a gun eventually, right? That's a problem. The historian in me is thinking back very quickly to terrorism 100 years ago. I mean, this is in the first round of all of this. It brought all kinds of anxiety, European society, Western society generally. And I wonder, and it's a crazy question, then I'll shut up. Is this a problem? Historically speaking, which is to say there are billions of people living on this planet. I've heard number 40,000 foreign fighters. I think rule of law initiatives hugely important to bring justice to the world. But I wonder whether or not there is really an extremist violence problem in this globalized world that we live in. Your response would be greatly appreciated.
If you want to take that on.
I do, because we created a map basically tracking terrorist attacks for the past 15 plus years. And you can see over time how much violent extremist organizations have been able to spread and how many people they've been able to kill and the other ways that they've transformed societies. So yes, just in terms of the sheer number of people who have died, I think it's a problem. You could make the argument that people die in a number of ways, and this is pretty low on the totem pole, but I think it's still significant when you look at the numbers and how they've really increased over the past couple of years. But for me as a human rights person, I care because extremist organizations, when they make inroads into these communities, fundamentally change the complex of those communities. I mean, you often see LGBT activists being gone after, human rights defenders are slayed, decapitated, like you're seeing in Bangladesh. There is a chilling effect when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association. The way that people are able to practice their religion changes. Women's rights are often one of the first sort of canaries in the coal mine. So I think that there are a lot of effects when it comes to the influence of violent extremist organizations beyond the most horrific effects, which are the mass atrocities, the genocide, the rape, the slavery, that are oftentimes in the headlines. So yes, I think we should care. I think it matters, but at the same time, I think we need to put it in perspective. And sometimes people lose perspective of where this fits in the range of threats. So we did a survey in 8 different countries, and in every single country except for China, violent extremism was people's top threat. They were afraid that extremist organizations were going to get weapons of mass destruction, that they were going to commit an attack in that country in the coming year. And the levels of anxiety were just through the roof, not proportionate to the threat in those countries. And when you have that kind of, anxiety level, you can make bad policy. So I think it's a problem. There are really harmful effects that go beyond the attacks themselves, but kind of keep it in mind so that our solutions don't make the problem worse, I would say.
Laura Livingston with the Public International Law and Policy Group. My question is in response to Michelle, your explanation of your work in Morocco. I'm curious mostly about the intersection between enhanced citizen awareness of their rights and government respect for those rights and how that fits into larger CVE objectives. Oftentimes the public doesn't know about due process rights or anything within the justice sector, but a lot of times you also find that government officials, especially lower level government officials, don't know about those rights either, especially in the context of recently drafted legislation. And I'm wondering if you found in the course of your work through educating the public about, the presumption of innocence or due process or anything within this larger framework, the government was then more inclined to educate themselves or respect those rights because they felt the pressure to do so.
That's a really good question, of course. I would say right now we don't have any sort of hardcore evidence to say that this has happened. Also because not enough time has progressed, quite frankly, for this to be the case. And the laws and the legal framework in Morocco are also sort of still developing. But part of our programming has also and does involve training for instance, on the participatory governance, we're also doing training for the government officials at the commune level as well. So we're training them on what the law, like with the government folks as well as the civil society, on what the law says so that they know what it says. And then flowing from that, what are sort of their responsibilities in regards to that. So, we're helping to explain or, just kind of explain to them what really it means for the government has a responsibility now under the law to accept draft laws from civil society, to if they file some type of complaint or a motion or something like this, they have a responsibility to respond to it. And so, but they don't know really this yet, that this is in the law, and they don't know, to no fault of their own, how do they go about doing this? And how do they go about communicating this? And how do they go about, from both sides, trying to build the trust that makes this type of partnership work? And that's really what one of our programs is all about. And on the other side, we've done some training for court clerks as well, involved in sort of the anti-corruption work I was mentioning as well. And a lot of that involved kind of increasing their awareness of all the rights that we're discussing in the program, but then also so that they can also then communicate with the community and explain to them what their rights are. So first we had to, again, sort of do training and capacity building for them so that they could also then be sort of the voice of doing that. But it's a very good question that you raised. Unfortunately, we just sort of don't have any hardcore evidence because it's all still in process. Ideally, if things were to move forward and we were to be in a very good situation, we might be able to find ways to follow this and to track it and to follow up. That is definitely possible, but it hasn't been enough time yet to say that really, and sometimes too, there's other intervening factors or other players and other things in action that you cannot always say that, this thing that you did here, and then there were, 20, things or whatever in between, that the best you might be able to say is that what we did contributed to this somehow. So, but that's a very good question. I think it's a question not just for our programming in Morocco, but oftentimes rule of law work in general. Yeah, thank you.
Really central to the M&E kind of
yeah,
question
exactly.
in this field. Yeah, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Hassan Sise. I'm a member of the Roli board. A couple of questions. One for the panel and another one for Mohammed, please. For the general question, I would like to ask about your thought on the relationship between what you call the main push factor, which is the curtailing of liberties, civil liberties in a particular country. And I would add to that also the perception in a particular community of international oppression on them. So between that and the effectiveness of what many of you have called the specific interventions to deal with violent extremism. And my question is, how do you see possible effectiveness of specific interventions on individuals or groups if the main push factor remains what it is? A state continues to oppress its people. A state continues to have support internationally from other actors to oppress its people. Yet we can isolate specific methods of interventions to deal with terrorism. So that's the first question. The second question wants to be a bit more granular on the issue of the specific methods of interventions. You talked about the fact that your organization is working with kids who are actually radicalized. And I'm just curious to know, first, how do you define that? Who are those kids uh, who accept to be put in the room and are identified as radicalized? And what is the process after you have identified those young people to actually help them out? What are the methods that are used, and which ones so far would you say are being successful? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great questions. So on the first more general one, does anybody?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question because I take the first question to maybe if I could reframe it a bit is to ask whether CVE specific program or responses can essentially transform the challenge into a technical issue, right? Because maybe the large drivers, the large structural drivers are still in place, but can it just become kind of can it have a tactical or a technical response? My impression is probably yes, but I think with a caveat that I think in the long run, the effective technical responses are likely to basically expose the contradictions in the larger drivers. So what I'm thinking of particularly is, let's say, a situation where there's a general curtailment of civil liberties within a society, which we have seen from the literatures associated with it as a driver of violent extremism. Finding alternative routes for expression for, let's say, young people might be a technical level response, but I think with time, a bunch of young people are finding other ways of articulating their own ideas, their own desires, trying to advocate for those. At some level, I think there's a limit. There's an upward limit to that, and you're probably you're probably in some ways creating a certain tension that's going to have to be, it's going to have to find some sense of relief. So I think in the short run, this is me kind of thinking out loud here in response to this. I think there's possibilities of transforming CVE responses, these kind of large rule of law issues, into technical responses. But I think there, at some point, there has to be a way in which those large drivers are addressed, and some of those technical responses may actually facilitate that.
I agree, and that's why I think you have to have this multi-layered response, and that's what we argued for in this Turning Point report. Yes, you need the interventions because you need to engage with those individuals who are being drawn into extremist ideologies and narratives and groups. At the same time, you can't ignore those national, regional, and international factors. And so essentially, we called on the US government and other governments to really think long and hard about the way that they're interacting with some of these authoritarian governments who are potentially part of the problem through the way they treat their own citizens, to really reorient our relationship, to think about our security assistance to those countries, and to ask ourselves if CVE really is a priority for the US government. How does that affect the way that we interact and support some of these governments, even while we're doing some of those programs at the local level and doing the intervention work?
Do you want to?
Just to answer your question, so there's two organizations that I think one is Parents. I'm going to get to my point about what we're doing. Parents After Hate, I think it was called by established by the father of Carlos Bledsoe, whose son, Carlos Bledsoe was radicalized, went to Yemen, came back, and killed service members at a U.S. Recruitment site to join the military. And so the father was frustrated the fact that there was no outlet, there was no one to call when something's happening and someone's been radicalized and they have no clue who to turn to. Because if they turn to law enforcement, it's going to go down a whole nother path. And so really this builds off what we're doing right here, and everything we're doing is just like what everyone else is doing. It's early, it's piloting, and we're seeking to scale up. So I'm honest about that. I think it's important to realize that we're all experimenting on this. But this started actually initially back in 2015 out of a group of people who saw the need to address early on some signs and some indicators of family members who were going down the path of extremism. And so I'm also on the board of the America's Islamic Heritage Museum, which is in Southeast Anacostia, Washington. And it's a community center as well. So this is very local, where community members know me, and they've known other people, and they've reached out to say, listen, we have a concern, we have a problem, and we need to do something about it. And so basically it's been an organic effort where communities have supported it, they have funded it, and we're moving forward on this initiative. So the process is not easy. I was dealing with this yesterday. There's another mentoring circle today, and more data will come out about that. We can talk more offline.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question, which is wherever the microphone is.
Angel Sharma, I work with ABA Rowley. I was wondering if you could provide some more clarification on how active women participants in extremist organizations fit into CVE. And by active women participants, I'm not referring to the passive ones who, I think we did address in the earlier panel as being mothers or wives of extremists, but rather participants in the action themselves, whether they're suicide bombers, and maybe some of the general trends that you may have observed in their recruitment process, or even some of the interventions that are much more useful towards them as opposed to male counterparts.
Anybody want to take on this or take on the gender issue more broadly?
Only thing I can add to say that, and I defer to my colleagues on this, but I would say that we have women or young girls and boy participants. And so the issue is pretty even in terms of as it relates to that, at least from our intervention side.
Yeah, I think the trends are increasing in terms of women's active participation as recruiters, as fighters, as bomb makers, and in other capacities within extremist organizations. We did this kind of future study as part of our big study and asked people from all over the world, including young people, informers, and current extremists, how they think the threat is going to evolve and how they think recruitment is going to evolve. And one of the things they pointed out is that security services and intelligence services within their countries were getting pretty savvy in terms of tracking and keeping the lid on young males within the age of like 15, to 24, 28. So extremists were therefore going to older men, women, and younger men and women, trying to kind of get around the fact that the security service were pretty tightly monitoring certain groups of young men. So I think that you might see extremist organizations going after more women, targeting them for recruitment. In terms of interventions, I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence that the approach would be different when trying to engage women than it would be for men, because if you're doing a good intervention program, and that's actually, I shouldn't even say good because everything is experimental at this point, but it's tailored to the individual. So just like the intervention would be tailored to the individual male, it would be tailored to the individual woman, and trying to understand what were the factors that led her to get involved with an extremist organization, and then trying to address those factors. I don't know if you...
May I just mention that I think one thing that's happening, at least within the research and the literature on it, is that people are starting to understand that women play many roles for many reasons, which is a positive development. I think for a long time, it was, a lot of the research was kind of blind to it. It was kind of young men and their problems, or it was women are victims, which is true, but is not complete, right? So one of the challenges, I think, in the literature and the research has been to understand that women have full agency and sometimes get involved for a variety of reasons, just like everybody else. In terms of responses, I think a lot have been mentioned so far, but I would also just mention a couple of religious leaders, Murshida or Murshidat in Algeria, for example. We have specific responses that work with training women to kind of be religious guides who are particularly positioned to work with women within certain societies like Algeria. And that's an opportunity to work both with them and to help them serve to identify signs of radicalization in other members of their family or members of their community. So there are some responses that try to tailor to women.
I just remembered something as Benjamin was talking. So we had a podcast with a woman from Nigeria. I'm blanking on her name, but she was doing disengagement and de-radicalization programs with men and women coming out of Boko Haram. And they found that the reasons the women joined was very different than the men. And so when they were doing the disengagement, they were trying to deal with the fact that a lot of women joined because they wanted kind of stature within their communities, and they wanted power, and they wanted more agency. So they were dealing with really different issues on the back ends in terms of reintegration than they were with the men.
I think ending on the note of the importance of specificity and diversity and tailoring is a good one to end on. And so I just want to thank all of the panelists and all of you in the audience. And